Finally, what about his fifth argument based on the suffering in the world? Well, I think it's undoubtedly true that the pain and suffering in the world is a tremendous emotional obstacle to belief in God. But that doesn't mean that this is a good intellectual argument against belief in God. I'm persuaded after much reflection on this problem that as difficult as pain and suffering might make it emotionally to believe in God, intellectually, the atheist is really shouldering an enormous burden of proof here which he cannot successfully sustain. Dr. Dacey's key claim here is that pointless suffering exists. Now, that claim is extraordinarily difficult to prove. In order to prove this claim, the atheist must prove the further claim that God does not have good reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. But how could the atheist possibly know that? When some incident of suffering enters into our lives, how could the atheist possibly know that God does not have a morally adequate reason for permitting it? Well, Dr. Dacey is aware of this problem, and so he gives a further argument to show that God cannot have good reasons for permitting suffering. But the problem is that both of the premises of that argument are pretty clearly false. Take the first premise that he gave. He says, we don't know of any kinds of goods that would morally justify God's permitting suffering. Well, I think that's just obviously false. I can think of all sorts of goods that would justify God's permitting suffering. From a Christian point of view, speaking in the broadest terms, God's purpose for human history is to bring as many people freely to a saving relationship with Himself, thereby securing their eternal life and eternal happiness. And I think it's not at all improbable that only in a world pervaded by natural and moral suffering would the maximum number of people freely come to know God and His salvation. So to carry his argument, Dr. Dacey would have to show that there is a possible world that God could create which has less suffering than the actual world, but has an equal amount of the knowledge of God and His salvation. And that's just pure speculation. But that's not all. The second premise, I think, is also wholly implausible. That premise says that if there were goods that justify God's permitting suffering, then we would know what they are. Well, I don't think that's true. The atheist seems to presuppose that if God has good reasons for permitting suffering in our lives, then He's somehow obliged to tell us what they are. But that seems very implausible. It would turn the universe into a haunted house. Every time I stub my toe, a voice would whisper, "Here's why I'm permitting this." And this would really get to be annoying after a while. Worse, what Dr. Dacey is asking for may well be logically impossible. For in certain cases, if God were to say, "Here's why I'm allowing this," then we might act in such ways as to prevent the justifying good from coming about, so that the suffering in that case would take place if and only if the suffering did not take place, which is logically impossible. So in that case, Dr. Dacey's premise is necessarily false. So I don't think his argument that God cannot have good reasons for permitting the suffering in the world is very good.
The one thought that I connected with William Lane Craig in that last video was to say what is happening is of no value. How could it be any good? Then he said the atheist is suggesting that there's another world that would be possible that would have less suffering, but also produce a greater number or amount of salvation for human souls. And what Craig is suggesting is, no, this is it. We do currently have the least amount of suffering that is producing the greatest amount of salvation. That's the intellectual equation or calculus that we would be able to suggest. Okay, so that's another thought. Let's now go to another one. This is a discussion. It's 8 minutes by Tim Keller. He's a pastor in Manhattan, in New York City, Manhattan. Been there for many, many years, and he's written some books you might be familiar with, The Reason for God and some others. But he gets into a discussion here as well with this as the topic. Let's listen in.
I went through 8 years of Catholic school, Sisters of Charity, and I got professional religious education throughout all those 8 years. Then I had 4 years of Jesuit prep school. And at the end of 12 years of religious education, I was an atheist. And then I came to Columbia. The sticking point in all that regarding religion for me was the Holocaust. I looked at that and I said, how is it possible that 6 million people could be exterminated in the course of a war that took 80 million lives, and there could be a God? How do you answer that question?
I'm going to push back and ask you, there sounds like there's two motives behind the question. Maybe they're both true for you. They're both very important questions. One is how could European civilization, which is based on Christianity for 1,000 years, produce something like that? Or was it much more general, and that is, how in the world could God allow that kind of evil and suffering?
That's the question I want.
The second one.
Yeah, the second one. Much more interesting.
Well, the first one is a terrible question, too. I mean, it's a terrible question to answer for a Christian minister. But as a pastor, I have to say that the Holocaust is awful, and yet as a pastor for the last 35 years, I've been sitting in rooms with people, as a pastor, with parents whose little, 2-year-old get run over by a car. I mean, it doesn't seem like a Holocaust, but it's the same kind of misery, the same question. Right. Why in the world would God allow evil and suffering? So I've been through it and through it and through it and through it. The right response to anyone who's actually in the middle of suffering is silence and love and speaking when spoken to. Answers I've given to people over the years when they've asked me. The one is, I actually don't believe it makes it any easier to handle or face suffering by disbelieving in God. And I actually do Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. He says, how do you know that a human deed is unjust, or a law? But he's talking about law, but how do you know a human law or deed is unjust? Only if there's a higher law that says it's unjust. Otherwise, what you've got out there is the strong eat the weak. That's how you and I got here. If there's no God, you and I came here through stronger organisms eating the weak organisms, natural selection. That's what life's about. That's utterly natural. Now, deep in our hearts, we feel, no, that's not right. But, the question is why? Now, what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying is, we believe that strong eating the weak is unjust and wrong because there's a higher law. If there was no higher law, he says, how do you even really justify your outrage? And
yet the strong eat the weak every single day.
Yes.
So why doesn't God intervene and say, you know what? You can't kill all those people. Stop it.
Well, I said there were two responses. The first response only is that it doesn't make it any easier. I mean, it really doesn't, because now, on what basis am I morally outraged? If strong eating the weak is natural, so what? So they did it. Stronger nations eat weaker nations, stronger individuals. So what's the big deal? What's the problem? I mean, that's fair. I mean, that's not a complete answer, but it's fair to say, yeah, now as an atheist, now how am I dealing with evil and suffering? Now I really have only a visceral reaction to it. I don't even have a real cogent warrant for saying this has absolutely got to stop. Other than that, I don't like it. But the second is, now you were raised, you went to Catholic school. The Christian view of God is very different than the other views of God, because the Christian view of God is that God came into this world and suffered. Now, I have a cat, and my wife and I love our cat, and we actually saw it once. We broke its leg by accident, but we fixed it for only $1,000, which we never in a million years would have thought we would ever do for a cat.
But well, you broke it, so.
We broke the cat.
You're kind of morally obligated.
And it suffered. However, I think it's fair to say, because it doesn't have the same kind of self-consciousness, I would say that a human being suffering is probably at least sort of some kind of higher order. You're more aware of things. There's more agony than a. if God really came to earth in Jesus Christ, then, and the suffering he went through on the cross voluntarily would have been far beyond my suffering. Now, what does that do? It does not, even after you believe that God would have come down and become vulnerable to suffering and death, that does not yet give us an answer to the question of what the reason is that God allows evil and suffering. But it does tell us what the reason isn't. It can't be that he doesn't love us, or he wouldn't have come down and gotten involved. It can't be that he doesn't care, or he wouldn't be involved. I don't know what the reason is he hasn't stopped it yet, but it can't be a lack of, it can't be a remoteness, it can't be indifference, or he wouldn't have come and gotten down involved. Now that assumes you believe the gospel. But if you believe the gospel, what it does is it keeps off the idea of indifference and says, I don't know why he hasn't stopped evil and suffering. But whatever the reason is, it can't just be indifference, hardness of heart, or lack of
Well,
love.
have you thought about it in terms of, the reason?
I mean,
Why didn't he come down and stop the Holocaust?
I don't know. But now,
Right.
at this point, you've got to ask yourself a question. If you can't think of a reason, does that mean there really can't be one? That's the Alvin Plantinga.
Right.
Have you heard the no-seeums? Oh, this is good. You'll like this. Okay.
Lay it on me.
All right. Well, now, you're an academic, so you realize philosophers talk like this. Neither of us are really philosophers, but you do know how they talk.
I do indeed.
Okay. He says, if you look into a pup tent and I ask you, do you see any St. Bernards? And if you don't see any St. Bernards, you say, no, I don't see any St. Bernards, then we can safely conclude there probably are no St. Bernards in the tent, because if there were a St. Bernard in the tent, you'd probably see it. But he said, if you look into a pup tent and I say, do you see any no-see-ums? Now, no-see-ums, if you live near the Great Lakes, are little gnats that are so small they come through the screen and bite you anyway. And he says, so if you look into the pup tent and I say, do you see any no-see-ums? And you say, no, I don't see any see-ums. I don't see any no-see-ums. That doesn't mean that there aren't any no-see-ums in there, because if there were, you couldn't see them. And he says, now, when you say, because I can't think of any good reason why God would continue to allow evil and suffering to happen, therefore there can't be one, you're assuming that whatever reasons there would be more like St. Bernard's than no-see-ums. Well, why should it be? I mean, he says this is probably cold comfort. Without the gospel of Jesus Christ coming into the earth and coming alongside of us, it's cold comfort. But what he's saying is you can't assume that just because you can't think of a good reason why God hasn't stopped it yet, there can't be any. And then the gospel says, well, whatever that reason would be, it can't be a lack of love.
Good stuff. I appreciate the mind that God has given these individuals to be able to process that information and speak it so clearly. The two thoughts in that one that I liked was atheism doesn't make suffering any easier. I mean, okay, but we still have it. And the second one was, if I can't think of a good reason, there must not be one. Well, that might not work either. So again, more information is coming for us to identify here. This next one is, again, J. Warner Wallace. He's our detective guy, and he's going to speak about this idea of does evil exculpate God's existence? In other words, exculpate meaning there can't be a God if this happens. Here are the things, there can't be a God. Okay, he's going to talk us through a case that his father worked on. Let's take a look.
Let's finish with something that some people believe is evidence against God, and that is evil. This is a case that my dad worked in 1974. It was a murder of a 10-year-old girl in 1972. This is my dad. He hates that picture because he feels like he looks bad in that photograph. He does look bad in that photograph, he does. First of all, he's got a big crease across his chest there, not just from the picture of being folded, but he's got this polyester suit. He hated that polyester suit. And then he's got his butt sticking out here, which is actually just his gun, but he thinks it looks like his butt, so he always hated this picture. He was walking a guy across to the courtroom who confessed to killing this 10-year-old girl. Every horrific thing he did to her. It's a 1,000-page transcript, and none of it is true. He didn't kill this little girl. He was crazy, but we excluded him with blood evidence on the eve of the trial. This case is still unsolved. But the terrible things that happened to this little girl, who I will call Jackie, were really hard to process. This is true evil. But like every act of evil I've ever worked, certain things had to come together in a certain unusual way in order for it to occur. First of all, she was a very trusting girl who would get in a car with somebody. Not every kid's that way. And not only that, it happened on a holiday. I said it happened on Thanksgiving, but in the book I said it happened on Christmas. This is still an open case, so I've changed it a little bit. But it was a holiday, and her parents were cooking dinner. They didn't even pay attention to what she was doing. If it's not a holiday and she's not that trusting, this never would have happened. But not only that, this guy who did this to her, trust me, he's got some issues. If he's like other pedophile killers I've worked, he's probably had a bad upbringing himself that led him to this place. If he doesn't have that bad upbringing and it's not a busy holiday and she's not that trusting, this doesn't happen. Not only that, it had access to a place to take her. Because we found her the next day, dropped off in Oxnard, one county north of us, on the rocks. But he had a place to hold her for a day. If he doesn't have that place and a way to get her there, none of this happens. And not only that, he had unbelievable opportunistic timing. I don't think he stalked her and watched her for some period of time. He just happened to be driving down the road when she happened to be available. Oh my gosh. If this set of circumstances doesn't happen just like this entire thing doesn't happen, and the relationships are very complicated. I may never know as an investigator what set of circumstances had to align perfectly that caused Jackie to suffer this evil event. And that's the problem. In the universe we have today, we also know that there are good reasons to believe God exists, but there's also one good reason to think he doesn't. I've already talked to you about the first 7. These are all things that point toward God. The best explanation outside the room. This is why we call this stuff inculpating evidence. The other kind of evidence that points away from somebody, like an alibi, is called exculpating evidence. Is the presence of evil and injustice in the universe the one thing that disqualifies an all-loving, all-powerful God? Because think about it. How could a God like this allow that to happen to Jackie? Epicurus is quoted with this phrase. I think it's pretty powerful, and it's millennia old. This is from about 600 BC. I'm sorry, about 300 BC. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Well, then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? If there's evil in the world, well, how can you say there's an all-powerful, all-loving God? He either's too lame to stop it, which means he's not all-powerful, or doesn't care to stop it, which means he's not all-loving. He's disqualified. And that's the question. Is God disqualified? I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. When I find there's a way I can explain a suspect's involvement, even though it appears to be exculpating evidence, I have to look at those. Here, I think there are 7 things, 5 or 6, 7 things that might explain why God would ever allow an evil act. And it's very complicated. I think he has to have a proper view of eternity, a proper view of free agency and the nature of what love really is, a proper understanding of the role it can be used to develop character, how it calls us to him, how sometimes evil just happens because you make bad decisions, it's not on God. And we have a limited understanding of the relationship between all these things. Why do I say this? Because in the end, all of these things have to be assessed before we consider any single act of evil. Let me just break out one of these. I break out all of them in the book. I'll break out one of these to show you what I mean. As an atheist, I had a problem with the problem of evil. But you shouldn't as a Christian, really. Here's what I mean. As an atheist, I believe that all of life was a line segment between 2 dots called birth and death. I expect to get 90 years pain-free in those 2 dots. If anything happens to steal away my pain-free 90 years, I'm going to be upset. And I'm going to see it as an act of evil. So, for example, if I get sick at 40, and then I suffer for 10 years before I die of cancer, I'm going to be upset. And I'm going to call this evil. Why? Because it robbed me of what I expected, because my view of life was the 90-year line segment. Got it? But what if I'm foundationally wrong about my presupposition? What if life is something other than this? What if life is not really a line segment between life birth rather, and death, but is actually a ray that begins at birth, runs through a point we call death, then continues on infinitely. What if that is a proper view of life? What if the Christian worldview is true? Well, you know, if you've been, how many of you in this room had a major surgery in the first year of your life? There are probably some people who did. You did. I'll bet you that was no fun. I bet you your parents were worried sick. If you'd have passed away in that first year, they would have seen that as evil. But now, years later, how old are you now? 12. By the time you're 10 or 12 years old, you probably don't even remember the pain you suffered as an infant because you've now had 10 years since the event. As a matter of fact, when you move further and further away from an evil, painful episode, it has less and less impact on your life. You already know that, right? So what you might call evil here has to be measured in terms of the context of your entire life. This is actually, for those of us who are circumcised, something similar, okay? You drop dead on that day, you're thinking, this really stinks, right? What kind of a life is this? But by the time you're 1, you can't remember. Well, if our worldview is correct and we have a proper understanding of eternity, then I don't care what mess happens in your life or how grievous it may be, it has to be measured in the context of eternity. And as you do that, your entire material existence ends up being a fraction of a millisecond compared to eternity. So all I'm saying is that now you have to measure evil in a different context. So a proper understanding of eternity is one of 7 things we have to consider when evaluating what real evil is in the context of any evil event. So if someone says to me, why would God allow that thing to happen to Jackie? There can't be a God who would allow that to happen to Jackie. Well, I can't tweet that back to you in 140 characters. I can't respond to that in a paragraph on Facebook. I won't even try. You shouldn't try either. Because it turns out it's a complex set of events. And not only that, they're in different proportions to one another. And they have different relationships to one another and causal connections to one another. It's so complicated. All of this then only begins to explain this act. Do you think I can do all of this in 140 characters? It's not going to happen. But every case I've ever worked is this complex. This is just the nature of working homicides. Something happens in a heartbeat. It takes me 30 years to put it back together. And when I do, she's still dead. This is the nature of evil. And this is why we know we have to evaluate evil differently. As a matter of fact, why do we call anything evil to begin with? How could we call? Do you mean you don't like it? Do you mean it's evil to you? And by your opinion, it's evil? Or do you mean it's transcendently evil for all of us? No matter who you are, it's truly evil. Really? Well, if it's truly evil, what are you using as your transcendent standard by which you would call something transcendently evil? Here's the problem. If evil's just your opinion, you can remove all evil tomorrow by just simply changing your opinion. That doesn't work, does it? No. Because evil is actually more than just your opinion, the opinion of your group, the opinion of your nation, the opinion of our planet. It's truly transcendently evil because it's measured by a truly transcendent standard of good. The C.S. Lewis puts it this way. As an atheist, he said, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. When I was complaining, this universe, what was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? You have to have a transcendent standard of just in order to call it. So if you're going to try to explain evil, sometimes we say, well, gosh, if there's a God, but there's evil, that excludes God. No, actually, if there's true evil, that requires God. Because you can't call this truly evil unless there's a true standard. All that's left to us is to figure out why God would allow it. But the idea that there's true evil requires God's existence because that's the measurement against which we're going to call anything truly evil. This means you're back outside the room again. And this is the best explanation. He finishes this by saying this, of course, I could have given up my idea of justice, by saying it was nothing more but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies.
He goes on for a while on that. You can watch each of these video presentations are usually snippets of a longer conversation, and you can watch more of that. But again, as I was listening to his answer there, it reminded me of Romans chapter 8. Just want to encourage us all to, again, familiarize ourselves with Scripture, with that powerful passage within Scripture, within Romans chapter 8. And I really like, again, his idea of there must be something. The moral argument is what he's presenting there as well, that there's a standard to which we are basing these evaluations on. We're not balancing it against nothing. It doesn't make any, it has no significance if it's balanced to nothing. The reason we have evil is because we understand good. And where did this standard come from? Instead of exculpating God, that he's saying, let's bring God back into the equation because of the nature of who God is. So some good stuff there. Ravi Zacharias is our next presenter, and he's getting a question. Again, they've oftentimes done a presentation, and now this is the Q&A that happens regularly after these types of events. So let's listen to this. This is a 9-minute answer.
This question is for Rabbi. You mentioned the story of that, I think you said he was Jewish and he was shot by, I think it was a concentration camp or something like that. And I'm going to play the devil's advocate for a bit and pretend I'm Sam Harris. No pun intended, of course. You stated that God was watching. God watched the gentleman pull the trigger. If God was watching, why didn't he make that trigger not work? Why didn't he make that poor individual just pass out while he was digging the grave? I believe Sam Harris would ask that type of question and demand an answer.
Yes, I appreciate that question. Playing the devil's advocate, you said that why didn't God keep the man from pulling the trigger rather than allowing the man to pull the trigger and then watch over him and bringing about some kind of judgment? I would say this to you, that the supreme ethic that God has given to us is the ethic of love. It is the peak of all intellectual and emotional alignment. This thing we call love, which places value upon the other person of worth and as something to be protected. It was interesting, of all people, it was Oscar Wilde who on his deathbed in his 40s, by his lover by his side, Robbie Ross, he turned to Robbie and he said, "Did you love any one of those little boys for their own sake?" It was an incredible question to ask by a man who was a hedonist on his deathbed in his 40s. And he said, "Robbie, did you ever love any one of those little boys for their own sake?" And Robbie Ross said, "No, I can't say I did." He said, "Bring me a minister. Bring me a minister." And it was in his magnificent poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, that Oscar Wilde said, only Christ was big enough to cleanse his heart and forgive him for all that he had done. The point even the hedonist realized was that in pleasure also, value and love are the supreme ethics that can be treasured. But you can never have love without intrinsically weaving into it the freedom of the will. You cannot have love without the freedom of the will. If you are compelled by some machine to a certain decision, you can never love. You can comply, but you will never be choosing to express that sentiment and the reality of love. If love is the supreme ethic, and freedom is indispensable to love, and God's supreme goal for you and for me is that we will love him with all of our hearts and love our neighbors as ourselves. For him to violate our free will would be to violate that which is a necessary component so that love can flourish and love can be expressed. If you're asking for God to always stop the trigger, why not God stop everything else? Next time you hold a cup of boiling water, he makes it frozen water instead. Next time you're about to cross the street and you're going to be hit, he pulls your leg back. What you're asking for is a different entity than humanity. As wonderful as it may seem that in stopping that you think he is protecting you from that which is destructive, the greatest denial that you're asking for is the freedom of your will to be able to choose and to love God with all your heart and all your soul. When you've got love as the supreme ethic and the freedom of the will to choose that love, all of the other contingencies come in and can become explained why it is possible to either choose or to reject so that love can ultimately reign supreme. If you want compliance and some kind of a mechanical response, your question itself will self-destruct. You're asking the question because you're free to ask it, and you're free to ask it because you're free to love. And when you love him, in spite of all of the contraries that you see around us, you're trusting him for having the supreme wisdom and the knowledge to ultimately bring a pattern out of it all. We think, for example, we know so much. The story is told in Mideastern folklore of this man who lost his horse that ran away. And when the horse ran away, the neighbor came to him and said, "You know, bad luck, isn't it? Your horse is gone." He said, "What do I know about these things?" A few days later, the horse came back with 20 other wild horses. And the neighbor came and said, "Amazing, it's not bad luck, it's good luck. You've got 20 more." Man says, "What do I know about these things?" His young son is going and taming one of the new horses. That young horse kicks him and breaks his leg. The neighbor comes and says, "Terrible, isn't it? Your son's leg is broken. Bad luck that these horses came." The fellow says, "What do I know about good luck and bad luck?" A few days go by and a bunch of thugs are coming looking for recruits to join their gang. And they're looking for all the able-bodied young men. And they're about to pick this young man but find out his leg is broken. And they say, "We don't want him. We're going to move on to the next house." So the man comes and says, "Good luck, isn't it? Your son's leg was broken." In one little series of episodes, we don't know what lies ahead. Why don't you wait till you stand before God face to face, and you will find out there were reasons why he didn't stop that trigger, so that you will see the heinousness of evil and see the majesty of love and good managing to navigate yourself as a pilgrim's progress to come to the celestial.
Yeah. Hold judgment to the end. We've talked about that with the concept of the wisdom of God. When I've shared that attribute with you, we talked about there's some things that we just need to remember. And the basic point is the game's not over yet. The game's not over. Wait until the end, as that Eastern folklore story spoke of. So some good reminders from Robbie. Robbie continues on, some more similar ideas on that. And let's hit that next one. Thank you, Steve. Doing a great job.
Absence of free will. If God created every fiber of our being, every atom, every impulse, did he not also create sin? Did he not also create Satan and his actions?
Let me go first, and then Vince will give you the substance of it. I'll take a stab at that. If the question is to hold together every assumption that is in that, what is the purpose of God doing that? Then, of course, I'm assuming you also are wanting God to remain in the paradigm and that he is the creator of the universe and your life and mine. When you know that an infinite, perfect God has created you and me, there are only 4 possibilities of God and creation. Number 1, that God would create nothing at all. Number 2, where he would create a world where there was no such thing as good or evil.
So again, these are 4 possible worlds or possible choices God could have made. The first one was he makes no world. The second one is he makes a world that doesn't have good or evil in it. It is a amoral world, not immoral, but an amoral world. Here comes now 3 and 4.
An amoral world. Number 3, where he would create a world where we would only choose good. Or number 4, create this world where there's the possibility of good and evil with the freedom given to us. No creation, amoral world where we would only choose good, or create a world like this where he has given us the freedom to choose good and evil. This is the only...
Give you a chance to write those down. Some of you are note-taking that.
Only one of the 4 worlds in which love is possible. If love is the supreme ethic, and love is the ethic towards which and the longing towards which we all strive, this is the only one of the 4 possibilities in which love is given to us as a legitimate possibility. Let me give you the illustration from a child and then move into some philosophical extensions of that. You know, when you are a parent, you look at life very differently than before you raise your first child. Then when you're a grandparent, you look at it even more differently than you did when you were a parent. When you're a parent, you are so preoccupied with the worries and the fears that your time is given over to that stress, dissonance. When you've got grandkids, the wonderful thing is somebody else does the worrying, and you can just hug and hold and say goodbye at the end of the day and get your life back again and get your house back again. I don't know why a country musician has not yet written a song about this. As soon as they go, you get your house back, you get your toys back, you get everything back. You know. But I watched my grandkids. G.K. Chesterton said he learned more from observing children than he ever did from studying philosophy. My 3.5-year-old grandson, Jude, who is now 6, he's a guy with an amazing vocabulary. I don't know where he gets it from, but he's got it. He's the guy who dangles his feet at the table and looks across the table and says to you, Papa, well, he's 6 now, so he was about 5 when he looked at me and he said, Papa, what is the meaning of sophomoric? Who's teaching this guy? Where is he getting all of this from? So when he's 3.5, he's a wee little tyke, sweet little boy, precious little guy. And his mother had lost her car keys, and she's looking all over the place and can't find it. She pauses, our daughter Naomi, slaps her forehead and says, I must be losing my mind. Jude comes and stands in front of her and said, Mommy, whatever you do, please don't ever lose your heart because I'm in there. Tell me, where does he come up with something like that? The longing to look at his mother and say to her, don't ever lose your heart, I'm in there. Love is the craving of the human heart to belong in the sacredness of trust and a relationship. And that is what you long for and I long for. God, in giving us freedom, gave us the greatest possible gift we could ever have with the greatest possible vulnerability at the same time. And once you know him and follow him and love him and enjoy his love, you will realize that for the sake of love and for the sake of that relationship with you, he gives you that freedom. And there are only 2 kinds of destinies that you have. You can bend your knee to God, said C.S. Lewis, and say to him, your will be done. Or you refuse to bend that knee to him, and he says to you, your will be done. If you really wish to enjoy the freedom of what this gift is all about for creativity and all, then this is the world that gives you the possibility of love and the beauty of the sacredness of a relationship. The more you get to know him, the less you ask the other question, because you know in his wisdom he has an explanation that in time and in eternity will be ultimately revealed. Let me give you one illustration and turn it over to Vince. You take your 2-year-old to a doctor for an injection, and the doctor is about to jab that needle, and the 2-year-old starts screaming and sits at the back of the car, and on the way back says, I don't understand my mother. She brought me here. for him to jab this in my arm. Not only that, I saw her paying him for doing that to me. And then comes a few years that go by, and there's a disease stalking the land. And that little one has grown up and said, if my mother hadn't done that, I would be a victim for what exactly is plaguing the country now. Time is a necessary component for understanding the big picture. I have no doubt God gives us the big picture when we say, I now get it. That is my brief answer to you. Thank you.
Well, one way to understand this challenge is that God is all good and God only creates good things. So how is it that putting good things together, if that's all that God creates, could wind up with sin and evil? Let me just quickly give you a more trivial example, but one that I find helpful in understanding this, and then a more serious illustration from my life. The example that I find helpful is going to a buffet. Anyone like going to a buffet? I really like going to a buffet, but I am not a good buffet eater because I go to the buffet and everything individually looks great. And I'm not able to process the fact that some of these things don't go well together. And so I put all of them on my plate and it doesn't go well then or for the rest of the night. That's how I think about this. God only creates good things, right? He creates the power for me to move my arm. He creates the power for me to have free will. They're both good things. I can use my arm to help someone up. But if I put those two things together in the wrong way, then it's not a good thing. And the more serious illustration in my life that makes me reflect deeper on this is of someone who, as a child, I can remember as a teenager, I wasn't very kind to him and he wasn't very kind to me. And I used those powers that God gave me to push him down rather than to help him up. And I remember taking every opportunity I could to put this guy down. And then I learned a number of years ago that he had taken his life. And at one point the Bible says, for the wages of sin is death. And I had read that verse hundreds of times, and it never really hit me until then. And I had to start asking questions like, would he have taken his life had I been kind to him? Had I used those very same powers of the movement of my arm and of the free will not to push him down, but to help him up? And I didn't know the answer to those questions. Sometimes I think we're too quick to look up and blame God for the evil in the world, and we're too slow to look to ourselves and turn that question around and ask, what is our part in that? G.K. Chesterton was once asked to write into a newspaper with an answer to the question, what's wrong with the world? And he wrote a very short letter. He wrote, Dear Sirs, I am sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton. And so sometimes I think we're too quick to look up and blame God, ironically the same God who, when he was hanging down a cross, looked at the ones who were producing evil in his life, and the instinctive words of his heart were, Father, forgive them.
Good stuff. Challenges our thinking. We have 3 videos left, but we're only going to watch 2 of them just for the time. I'm going to now do number 6, which is the next one on our sheet. We're going to skip number 7. Feel free to watch that on your own. That'd be great. But then we'll have time for number 8 as well. So these are both Frank Turek, and he's giving his position on some of these questions.
What's your name?
Susie.
Hey, Susie. How you doing?
You had spoken of a book earlier, Chosen But Free.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was kind of wondering, because he kind of asked the question I had, but I've always had the question, Judas's role. So my uncle
You always had the
asked
question,
me,
what now?
Judas's role.
Judas's role, yeah.
So my uncle asked me the question. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think he's an atheist, but I'm not sure exactly what he believes. But he asked me, and he says, if God is all-knowing and he knows everything from the beginning to the end, he says, then are we created to go to hell? Like those he creates, and he knows they're going to fall. Does he create them? And I wonder about Judas.
Yeah.
Was he created for that moment?
Yeah,
And
excellent
for hell,
question.
or would God have picked another way?
When God creates the universe, he knows how it's going to turn out because he knows all things. So when God creates the universe, He knew Judas would betray him, and he knew that certain people would go to hell. You say, well, why would God create a universe that people would go to hell in? Well, it could be, because some people will say, well, why didn't God create a universe where everyone believes? While that's logically possible, it might not be actually achievable with free creatures. Because by definition, if you're free, you can sin. So it might be that God creates, any universe God creates, people are ultimately going to sin. Okay? So he can't force people to love him, because love by definition must be freely given. It can't be forced. This universe could be the universe where the maximum number of people are saved and the minimum number of people are lost. So God creates a universe, and let's just use Judas. Suppose Judas is in hell. He knew Judas was going to go to hell, but Judas freely chose not to trust in Christ. He is getting justice. If God could save Judas, he would have, but Judas didn't want to be saved, because Judas did not want to love Christ. He did not want to trust in Christ. So, and God, by the way, can even get his will done through evil, as we mentioned earlier with Joseph. God can get his will done through atheists today. In fact, none of us would be, if you're a Christian in here, you wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for atheists. Because I guarantee you there are atheists in your bloodline. You wouldn't even be here. I wouldn't be here.
So then his question, because I kind of talked a little bit about that, and his question would be, then why would he have created them to begin with? If he already knew, why would he have created them?
Well, no, well, because still they're freely going to go their own way. Here's the real question that needs to be asked. Is God justified to create a universe where some people freely reject him? Or is he obligated to create no universe if one person rejects him? And I think the answer is no. He's not obligated to create, or he's not obligated to not create. Sorry for the double negative. He's not obligated not to create just because people reject him. He thinks, rightfully so, that he loves everybody, and if some people don't love them back or love him back, then he can still create a universe where some people do love him back. And he's not immoral for doing so. In fact, he is the standard of morality. So you can't argue against God and say, well, God is immoral for doing this. Right?
Okay, one more video to watch. I guess the question is, Frank Trek just said, implied that you can't argue against God. Well, let me just say, well, sure you can. I know he means something by that. You can shake your fist at God. You can do whatever you want. That doesn't mean that you'll win. That doesn't mean that you have the moral high ground. That doesn't mean that you have the better response or better answer, okay? But sure, as far as arguing and throwing some ideas out, certainly you can do all of those things. So with that in mind, we got one more to watch. And again, Frank Turek gives us what about stopping the Holocaust? Again, his take on that significant, again, standard question.
So basically, we're like, why does God not intervene, stop these things? And I personally, I've looked into this enough to know I would not bring up the problem of evil as some, like really great argument. I don't think it's a great argument against God. I think there's like satisfying-ish answers regarding it. I wouldn't bring it up. But throughout the Old Testament, yes?
Do you mind just going to the question if you would?
Sorry about that. So throughout the Old Testament, there's plenty of examples of grand theatrical examples of God answering prayers, directly preventing evil from befalling his people, the Israelites. And I kind of like, I know it's played out, but I look at the Holocaust and I wonder, that would have been the perfect time. He could have sent like a couple angels, wipe out the Nazi armies. There's photographs. We have telegrams at that time. Would have been grand. Whole world would probably end up believing God that way. And I'm just wondering what happened there.
Yeah, that's an excellent question.
None of us have the answer as to why God didn't intervene there, just like I don't have the answer as to why God didn't intervene here on April 30th. But I know why I don't know why. I'm finite, he's infinite. And it wouldn't even be evil, the Holocaust, or the murder that took place here, the murders that took place here, unless there was a standard of good. The very reason we're upset about the Holocaust and what took place here is because we know people are inherently valuable. They're not valuable just because I think they're valuable. They're valuable because they're made in the likeness and image of God, and if God doesn't exist, we're just molecular machines. So why worry about 6 million Jews dying if we're just molecular machines.
So the whole question doesn't even need to take into account of that. My question is just about, so he was willing to wipe out armies back then, and he couldn't do it now when they're crawling over each other, begging God in the gas chambers. That's basically it. I'm not even accounting that.
Well, remember, the Old Testament is the story of the chosen people getting in the chosen land to bring forth the chosen Messiah to save the whole world. But there are also times in the Old Testament when God didn't stop the Babylonian army, when God didn't stop the Assyrian army, when Jeremiah is lamenting in the book of Lamentations that the mothers in Jerusalem had to resort to eating their own children to survive. Most of the time, God doesn't intervene directly. He did so in certain occasions because he's bringing forth the promised people in the promised land, but a lot of times he doesn't.
Yeah, in Jerusalem a few weeks ago, I sat with a man that his job, he's the general controller of the claims conference. He's about $90 billion that the German government has paid in reparations and restitution and stolen property. So I work Yad Vashem, people on the board there, which is a Holocaust memorial there in Jerusalem. I spend a lot of time with the Jewish people who deal with this question. What they would quickly say is that there was something stopped, that though there was this extermination of people, that there was a deliverance. Something stopped. In other words, what was going to happen was going to be at a far wider scale than even that was the beginning to show. And so what they see is, yes, it was horrible. They would say to you, if the Jewish people that I know and work with would say to you, they would say this was an expression of what really man is capable of. We want to see what God's capable of, but what about us? Well, how deep does this evil potential run? And we just got a glimpse of that. We just got a glimpse of that. So that's not, it's interesting how we immediately turn on God of why didn't you stop it, though it did stop, though it could have been far, that was just the beginning. That would have just been the beginning of other nations and other just mass exterminations. But the question is, what is this like the Adolf Eichmann that was tried in Nuremberg? I filmed the special in Nuremberg at the Human Rights Memorial there, where they pledged never again to see these basic human rights violated. But yet Adolf Eichmann, who was the architect of that, when a Jewish man went in the very famous trial and he looked at Adolf Eichmann and he realized, and he wrote in his memoirs, he said, I saw Eichmann and I realized that Eichmann is in all of us. Eichmann is in all of us. There's something inside of all of us that maybe it doesn't express itself in that kind of drastic way yet, but there's something inside of us, inside of you, inside of me, that God has to touch.
I absolutely agree that, people are not inherently so good. I'm just, I can't reconcile, like clear-cut examples of God answering prayers, but then the second it's like, heavily televised world news, such a vivid, well-documented example, perfect example, people are just begging him by name, it's just, I can't.
Jonas, God doesn't want us to believe in him. Does that sound a little crazy? Yeah, it does. Let me put it another way. God doesn't want us to believe that he exists. He wants us to trust in him. Do you know that Jesus of Nazareth didn't just heal, raised Lazarus from the dead. And what did Caiaphas say immediately after that? This guy's the Messiah. No. He said, it's better than one innocent man die than all of Israel go down. In other words, the reason Jesus was killed is because he claimed to be God, blasphemy to the Jews, sedition to the Romans, and he spoke truth to power. And the temple priests didn't want him to be the Messiah because they wanted to do their own thing. Jesus was bad for business. And I submit to you that every one of us in this room is capable of suppressing the truth if it's inconvenient. And we do, don't we? I submit to you that if we lived in Nazi Germany, most of us would have happily been Nazi guards. We'd have justified it in our own minds. Because if we resisted, we'd be killed. We're just going to go through with it. In fact, people who have researched genocide, without exception, every one of the researchers says that the people, as Rice just said, who committed genocide were normal, everyday people.
Well, what an uplifting time we've spent together. Challenging to our own hearts and minds. May God give us the grace to endure, to give an answer to those who ask about not just the hope within us, but the faith within us. We will certainly be wrestling with these topics. Let me ask God's blessing as we conclude. Father, I do thank you for the opportunity to consider these thoughts, to be able to engage with these videos and these individuals who are attempting and pressing forward with logic and answers and some deep thinking that gives us some hopes, gives us some evidence for the faith that lies within. I pray that you would continue to advance the cause of Christ. I pray that you would minister your grace and comfort to those who are enduring evil and suffering. I pray your blessings for Mark Olivier's family as they mourn the loss of Mark's father. I pray you administer your grace to them. I pray your blessing on Chuck and Priscilla this evening as Chuck has had a unfortunate incident today. I pray you administer your grace to him as well. And for all of our cares, we bring them to you. In Jesus' name, amen. I've just prayed for Chuck. Let me just tell you, we've been back and forth playing phone tag today, but Chuck had an accident and he sliced off part of his finger. I'm not even sure which one. He's a woodworker and that kind of stuff, and he got bit by a saw. So again, ouch. And Mark has suffered the loss of his father, and so we want to be in prayer for him as well. So let's fellowship together. Let's pray for one another. Let's continue to do what the church does. All right. I'll see you again in this format sometime in January. We're not exactly sure. I'm getting with the calendar with Kathleen as well, but it might be the second week in January. Not exactly sure, but you'll hear about it through our regular announcements. All right. Have a blessed evening.